This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders that are designing our future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and you may know by now that I love having doctors on podcasts. It's my chance to finally put them in the hot seat, and today I got another one joining me. His name is Dr. Rick Van Pelt. He's the author of the new book, It's Not What You're Thinking, Precision Problem Solving with No Hypothesis. Dr. Van Pelt has over 3 decades of experience as a board-certified anesthesiologist and leader in healthcare transformation. We're going to talk about said transformation, why he thinks that the healthcare industry is perfectly designed, in air quotes, to deliver its current results, and we'll discuss the near-catastrophic moment that changed his life forever. Dr. Van Pelt, welcome to the Authority Company Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing really well, thanks. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you for asking. And so I want to start our conversation by talking about change. I know a lot about your book is about change, but you work in the health industry. And if there's one thing I know from having friends and acquaintances and clients in it, healthcare does not like change. They don't like big changes, and then small changes take decades. So tell me about the idea of problem solving and fixing things. And we're going to get into the heart of the book in a second, but just how we move the needle in the world of healthcare.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think over the years, I clinically am an anesthesiologist and did a lot of clinical time before moving into, the area where I am now, which is a lot of redesign, process improvement. And I think one of the things that I have recognized with change, to your point, is that change is difficult for everybody. And, particularly for big industries or big service industries like healthcare that have complex parts and lots of different groups of individuals who have their own interests, is fundamentally, we're all kind of looking out for our interests first and then the greater good second. And I would say that one of the biggest challenges with change that I've come to appreciate more and more is that change is personal. That is very easy to look at change from a distance and to kind of see it. You may or may not agree with it. But as long as you can do what you want to do within the context of the change that's out there, you're going to keep doing what you do. And when you get closer and closer to having to actually not just be a part of the change, but actually have to be involved in the change, that's when people start to push back.
And a big part of fixing things and changing things is the money element. I often joke, Doc, is that capitalism, it's the best ism. I think we've proven that capitalism works. But at the end of the day, sometimes it just mucks up things up, because if you think about it, that's probably the biggest driver, right, in your industry in terms of why things don't change. You have these giant pharmaceutical companies, giant insurance companies, giant health groups. So there's a lot of large forces there that are driven by the dollar, as opposed to, to steal your phrase, the greater good.
Right. Well, so, I think one of the popular phrases that is out there is no margin, no mission, and so there's always, I think people come into healthcare generally to participate in the greater good, to your point, if you're a provider or even on the administrative side is, we want to improve healthcare. But if you basically use the mantra of no margin, no mission, then what does your mission become? It becomes margin. And so again, you get into a situation where that objective starts to overshadow what actually needs to be done to improve care. And you create a conflict where you're constantly saying, well, I got to make money, so we can't do this. And if you have to obviously generate revenue and generate a margin, but if you get lopsided in that direction, then you can very easily lose track and lose your path as far as what actually needs to be done.
Yeah. And on a side note, I don't know if you could humor me here. I often like to bust doctors' chops about the fact that most of them don't know how a calendar works. They schedule things and then they run behind, and then you're sitting in the waiting room for 45 minutes. And I bust their balls. I'm like, hey, listen, do you guys know how clocks and calendars work? Like you set a time, and I know it's more complicated than that, but as an anesthesiologist, I'm curious. Just I'm not sure about like your relationship to the OR and stuff, but is it the same thing where you're like waiting around for the surgeon? Like, where's this guy? You know, we got this surgery coming up. Is that something that you've run into as well?
Yeah, well, it's, the coordination of all these moving parts is really challenging, right? And so people, it's sort of a cascade of delays, if you will, and behaviors where, looking at the surgeon, for example, if they basically look at the OR and go, this is a really inefficient environment for me to do what I have to do. And they often point to anesthesiologists as being part of the problem, right? We're too slow. So basically what happens then is they go, well, I can't do anything about it as a surgeon. So I'm going to use my downtime that I really don't want for other things. And then when everybody else tries to be efficient, the surgeon's not there because they're doing other things. And so, they get pushed back for doing that, but they're going, well, I'm not going to waste my time waiting. And then, everybody's finger pointing at everybody else. And before you know it, we're all just kind of accepting our, our, uh, our existence, if you will, and figuring out what we're going to do with the inefficiencies to, do, anything to make it more worthwhile. And it's never coordinated, right?
It's funny, Doc. It's like high school never ends. Like, think about it. You guys are the higher echelon of like the country and the world. Like the medical profession is seen as almost godlike figures, and then you guys are still bickering like your high school kids. Tell me about that little drama. I've never heard that before. So surgeons complain about you anesthesiologists because the patient's not out quick enough for their liking. Tell me more about this. I love this.
Well, so so it's again, it's everything is connected, as I always say. But if you're an anesthesiologist, we're responsible for actually moving patients through the operating room environment, with the nurses and everybody else. So we have a schedule, and what happens a lot of times is, patients can show up late, and so you can't adhere to the schedule, or patients have sort of last minute things that need to be done, or there's missing information. And so now we have to get that information or do the lab test or whatever it is before we can go to the OR. So we're delayed. And then, there's probably a misunderstanding of what anesthesiologists actually do, because again, the stereotype is, we just put people to sleep and then we just read the paper and, when they're done, we wake them up. Where, patients are really sick, particularly in these, big academic medical centers like where I work, where you basically go, you know what, you can't just, it's not just about sending a patient off to sleep. There's a lot of things to consider. And so a lot of times that gets overlooked. Things have gotten a lot better in the meantime, but, those perceptions persist. And again, you come back to basically saying, what's in it for me? Everybody's going, what's in it for me? I've got to do what I want to do. And, when you approach sort of a team activity with that kind of attitude, which is high school and everywhere else, then you don't get your super team and your super output. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the work that interests me, is basically saying, how do you break through that?
Yeah, and the last thing on this is, it is funny because I think if I would put myself in the shoes of the surgeon, I'm like, I kind of need the anesthesiologist to do his job, so I should give him some grace because I can't cut open this human body unless the person's out. So I don't know, maybe I'm thinking it from coming in from the wrong perspective, but I think like, hey, you in anesthesiologist, I kind of need you, so I'm gonna kind of give you a few minutes break here just because I can't do anything without you.
Yeah. But again, and again, I mean, we're super generalizing here. There are a lot of good relationships, but surgeons kind of look at it and go, this case is scheduled for 7 o'clock or whatever, and you need to be ready. If you need more time to be ready for me, then you got to start earlier. And then we're going, well, we have lives too, and we have things that we have to do as well that get in the way. So, again, everybody's kind of struggling with the same challenges, but again, the perception of what's going on with your teammates is not always clear.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for humoring me. I know we kind of went down a little rabbit hole, but I appreciate you indulging me. Let's peel the onion of the subtitle of the book, because I think sometimes subtitles of the books are sort of like throwaway lines, but like literally the subtitle of your book is your concept, the precision problem solving with no hypothesis. Tell me
Yeah.
about how this differs from traditional problem solving methodologies.
All right. So I think, a fundamental problem solving methodology, a mindset is always related to what should be. So we basically say, well, I have a certain assumption, certain things are, I have a certain problem. Here's what I think is going on, and here's what I think we should do to fix it. And usually what I call that is jumping to solution, because most of the time you don't really understand what the problem is. You just know you have to do, sort of the opposite of what's going on. We're inefficient. I'm not getting into the OR at 7. So we need to get to the OR at 7. That's the solution. And basically what precision problem solving is more about saying we've got to understand what actually is happening, right? We make assumptions about why we're not in at 7, using that example, but we don't understand why. So we actually have to look without assumptions at what's going on before that keeps us from going in at 7. And so precision problem solving is really, it's not rocket science, but it's one of those, common sense, not commonly practiced ideas or principles that basically say, if you understand the cause or the root, the nature of whatever the problem is, the solution defines itself. And so it's really about saying, don't show up with a hypothesis or some assumption that you're chasing and narrow your field. Is just, can you look? Can you recognize that you make a lot of assumptions when you look at something and you really aren't seeing it, and put that aside and then understand what's going on as completely as possible. And based on that, a solution comes out that makes sense for everybody involved. And then you're on the right track.
Well, the opening of our conversation beautifully dovetails to my next point. That's about conflict. It's serendipitous as things happen in conversations, but you talk about conflict resolution in the book, and also you note a kind of near catastrophic story with a woman named Linda. Tell me about that and how that shaped sort of like the way you handle conflict resolution.
Yeah. So, I think, conflict is everywhere. Conflict is basically, again, it kind of boils down to this, what I would say is simple comparison of what I think is happening and what I think should be. That's sort of our fundamental challenge. And everybody shows up. If you look at your life, everybody has assumptions, everybody has expectations, everybody has opinions. And most of those are, partially fact-based and a lot of idea. And so they're just not completely correct. But we show up and we do that. So the real challenge, and one of the things that I've noted with improvement initiatives, is that you get to a point where people go along and say, again, you get closer and closer to your own personal change boundary, if you will. And you basically get to a point where you go, this no longer aligns with how I view my assumptions or how I show up at work or elsewhere. And you basically say, I'm not doing this. And so the fundamental there is then to say, okay, so it's not really the functional problem that's stopping you from finding a solution. It's the conflict side. And so how that relates to this patient experience that I had with Linda Kenny when I was clinical was I was involved in her care and basically did an anesthetic nerve block procedure on her that I followed, as complete standard of care. And long story short, it nearly killed her because the medication went into the wrong place and stopped her heart. And so we saved her, through, I would say a lot of good fortune of having the right things that needed to be there to get her out of the mess that we created. But one of the things that's was probably more profound than that event itself was the response of the hospital and my care team members, my colleagues, which was immediate shutdown of sharing any information about what happened. So it was basically at the time, this was back in 1999, a situation where when bad things happened, we did our best to basically keep it under wraps. So the goal was not to make it visible. The goal was not to talk to the patients. It was basically just to kind of say it was a complication and let's figure out how we can kind of get through this without actually disclosing what happened. And there was a part of me that, had grown up in that environment, so I kind of knew it, but all of a sudden, this was me at the very sharp end of a really bad outcome, where that whole set of assumptions of this is what we do didn't resonate. And there's a part of me that was just like, I can't do this. Like, how can I not have a conversation with the patient and the family about what had happened, and how can we just try to brush this aside and move on? And so it kind of put me in a position of conflict again, where, on one side I was supposed to stay quiet and, just behave, keep working. And the other side of me was saying, this is not okay. I have to do something. And ultimately there was just sort of this moment where, the patients again kind of recovered. I was not allowed to see her. I made multiple attempts to try to, talk to her, and, it just kind of apologized basically. And she was, I was kept away. She was discharged home, and I just had sort of this lowest point in my life at that time where, I just had no closure. Like, nobody was talking to me about the event. I couldn't reach out to the patient, and, it was almost like I had um, a brain shutdown, if you will, where it's just like, on one side, everything had worked out from the hospital standpoint as far as keeping it under wraps. But here I was, in distress, just sort of moral distress, if you will, where I just kind of surrendered. I was like, I don't even know what to do, how to manage this. And I just had in that moment of silence, I don't know how to describe it, just a flash and insight that said, do the right thing. You just harmed somebody. Don't worry about your own lawsuit, how you're going to be, what the impact or the outcome is going to be. Just do the right thing and reach out and apologize. And so I wrote her a letter. I decided on my own that I was just going to reach out and, and take what was correct action. Wasn't for me. It was basically just saying, this is the right thing to do. And, if I was going to get sued, I was going to get sued, and so forth. So, basically the outcome of that was, that, I kind of went back into healthcare, was doing my thing, and really, I really sort of lost the joy in work from that, because it was just going back. Now it was just, number one, or among other things, I did everything right and almost killed a patient. And number two is, there's just, nobody, nobody was talking about it. It was just, I had to kind of rebuild my confidence. I had to kind of, think about, are my colleagues, do they trust me as a teammate now? Because it was all this blame, finger pointing stuff. But anyway, long story short was I sent this letter to Linda, and I didn't hear back for about 6 months. And then she had her own kind of experience where, she essentially went through her care and nobody told her what had happened to her, other than she had an allergic reaction
Wow.
to the medicine. And anyway, she started to, in over the period of months, as she was kind of reconnecting for her care, started to realize that a lot of her care team, was really emotionally impacted by what had happened. And so she sort of had, again, sort of her moment, if you will, where she started to see, a need for support to be provided to care teams, because number one is not the right thing not to do that. But number two is, I don't want I don't want to be taken care of by, damaged caregivers who are not being supported. So anyways, we reconnected, and, she reached out to me, and basically, was her first question to me was, "How are you doing?"
Wow.
And, and nobody had asked me that. This was 6 months later, and not one person had reached out. And here was the patient, asking me that. And long story short is, I kind of we came together and then started to say, we got to do something about this lack of support. And we actually then, kind of took on the system, if you will, and said, we got to do something about this. Everybody thought we were crazy. What can two people do against a healthcare behemoth? But by sort of landing in that space of it's the right thing to do and just taking a stand for the right thing, things happened, and we started to get national attention and so forth. So for me, the way it kind of connects to conflict was sort of that moment of basically saying, that moment of insight, if you will, was sort of a recognition of conflict resolution not being a thought process. Like you have to move beyond your normal mechanisms of thinking of, this is what I think is happening, what should be, to just kind of stopping that process and just looking, right? It's just saying, what's going on here? And, and basically from that and sort of the observation that, a compassionate outreach and sort of acknowledging the stress that is associated with change and creating an environment where you say it's normal to be, afraid of change and to want to stick to things, sort of became a foundation for, all the other conventional pieces of process improvement, that when combined really are very powerful in moving teams forward beyond their own conflict.
That's a great story. Thank you very much for sharing. And I know folks read more about that in the book. And it's interesting, the culture of healthcare. I mean, we talked about how externally we view healthcare, but internally, the way you describe it was you almost have that sort of like what police officers have, like blue wall of silence. So I'll call it a white wall of silence. But then behind that white wall, there's the finger pointing and people blaming each other, which you don't see in other organizations that have that sort of like wall up. How do people like I'm trying to figure out like how that works. Like you're blocking yourself off. You're essentially isolating yourself out from the rest of the world. But then within that isolation, you're all just treating each other like crap. Like and again, we are generalizing, like we mentioned, Dr. Van Pelt,
Yeah.
but it seems like that's not good.
No, and again, I would submit that this is not a healthcare challenge, right? Like at the end of the day, when you kind of step back and you say, what's going on there? You like using healthcare as an example is, we're all the general mantra for, how do you keep patients safe and get things done is vigilance, right? It's sort of your job to make sure that your patient gets the care that they need and they get through safely and so forth. Which already is a message that, you can't rely on the processes and the care structure within which you work. You have to make it work, right? And so it becomes kind of an individual effort, to within a system that, is dysfunctional in many ways, despite best intentions. And so, it's almost a defense mechanism where you basically go, so we know, the mindset is, well, nobody's going to fix the system. We can't fix what we're working in. So you're responsible. And so you can think about it, when something goes wrong, you can't blame the system. You have to blame somebody, and you have to protect yourself, right? Like I can't be involved with it. I can't go on if I know that this could very easily have happened to me, just as it could have happened to you. So I go, Joe, it's your fault,
Yeah.
and it's not because you're being malicious, as you're protecting yourself, right? And the result is, it's not, there's sort of there's an anger, and, there's all that call it pettiness that goes around the blame game, but people are hurting behind it because they know it's not right. right? You're kind of stuck. And so it's really acknowledging, it's saying that, the behavior that shows up in blame is partly because collectively we're not addressing what the real problem is, and we're sort of by default being pinpointed as targets, but it feels lousy, right? And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, or in whether you're in first responders, or even think about all of the even in the military, like you're trained to fight, and how many soldiers come out damaged, right? And again, it's just sort of that underlying imbalance, or it's just that personal thing. This is just not right. There's something that does not sit well with who we are at our core.
Yeah. And in the book, people might call me sarcastic, but I prefer irony. I'm a big fan of irony. And you have this line in the book that I love where you said that the healthcare system is perfectly designed to deliver its current results. And I get there's a sense of irony there where it's like, yes, it's just perfection to give us what this is. What are some systemic changes you think are most critical to break this sort of cycle of like, we've got this perfect system that gives us this?
Yeah. Well, I think fundamentally one of the interesting things when, the more you do this work is kind of what I mentioned before, which is everything is connected. And so, it again, to me, I would say fundamentally the opportunity for big change is just learning to look. It's basically just saying we've got to start looking at the problem as it actually is, and get out of our assumed sources of what the problem is. So it doesn't really matter, where you start, but one of the ways that we pinpoint where to start is we kind of tap, what I would say is sort of the conflict levers. So when we start doing an initiative, like you could say, all right, we have a challenge with the emergency department. It's because every hospital is challenged with, overcrowding of the emergency rooms with boarded patients and all kinds of things. And, most of the time somebody will come in and say, well, you got to fix this, go fix this one thing. We come in and basically, with the understanding that it's complicated and everything's connected, we'll pull all the stakeholders that have some touch point to the ED. And we'll start with a really open-ended question, which is something like, what are the issues and concerns that to delivering exceptional emergency care, right? And now you kind of, people tap their frustrations, right? They tap their sources of conflict, and they start to share what bothers them, right? And based on that, you start to, again, not get to the specific problem in every comment, but people start to hear what different participants have as concerns, and they start to realize that, oh, this problem's a little bit bigger than my perspective. And then ultimately, if you do it long enough, when you basically keep it open and keep recording their concerns visibly for everybody to see, everybody starts to see that, what, for all the differences that we have, there's a very common set of concerns that apply to everybody. So we basically start to move from sort of this fragmented group to seeing alignment, to then basically saying, okay, if we organize now the mess, the issues, we can actually start to define a specific area of problems. We call it the critical 20%. It's Pareto's law. 20% of the variables create 80% of the results. And so we try to say, let's just focus on that 20% and not, and capture the 80. And so, so you basically start bringing a team, a group of players who all have common interests, but very different approaches, and very, I'll say team or individually centered approaches to care, into an environment where you go, no wonder this isn't working, and here are some key things to do. And the way it relates to, that phrase that you just mentioned, everything is perfectly designed to deliver the result it gets, is that, wherever you pull a lever, there's an immediate response across multiple systems and multiple touch points um, that are impacted that nobody pays attention to. And if all you see is your lever and you basically say, well, I'm the surgeon, or, I'm the ED doc, and I'm going to take care of what I'm responsible for and make sure that what I need is available, and I don't care about anything else, you're inevitably going to disadvantage somebody else downstream or upstream with that approach.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about, like, getting the players all together, and why do you think peer support is sometimes overlooked when it comes to these initiatives and these improvement initiatives?
Yeah.
Because I feel like, I've been in companies where there was a time when they decided that there was this level of management that they felt was unnecessary. Like there was like these project management type people, and without maybe they did, I don't know, I'm sure, without actually talking to the boots on the ground, they just arbitrarily just remove these positions. And at the time, I remember saying to my coworkers, I was like, "What? Why did they do that?" And then I broke down, like, without those people, X, Y, and Z is going to happen. And so within a few months, this former company of mine, they decided to bring back a lot of those positions. So why do you think that step? Because it seems like that peer support of it would make those initiatives easier, because at the end of the day, those peers, Doc, they're the ones who's going to implement that change. The suits in the C-suite and the boards, they're not going to do it. They're not involved. But for whatever reason, peers are not included in these decisions.
Yeah. So yeah, you're bringing up some really important points. With regard to peer support, which is really sort of addressing, I would say call it the emotional elements of change, or of the work that we do, our activities, is there's sort of a conventional mindset that says change is about data, change is about process, and we don't have time to worry about what you feel about it. Is we just have to get this thing done, right? And so there's sort of a mindset of saying park your emotions at the door and show up with a problem solving attitude. And so you miss a huge source of information by doing that, and you also deny the impact and the stress that the dysfunction is actually creating for people, right? So you're immediately kind of alienating them. And then, to your point, if you have somebody from management, if you will, who's not doing the work, saying, I know what your problem is and just do what I say, you further distance the people doing the work from the solution, because they look at it and they go, that's never going to work. And there's no outlet to share it. And so, so they immediately create a workaround. They're immediately thinking, all right, they're going to want us to do this. And everybody's immediately thinking, well, if they do this, our workaround is not going to work as it currently is. So how am I going to create the new one? And their whole attention is there, right? Because it's conflict again. So what we basically try to do is to say, we know you're in pain. We know that this system, care delivery process, whatever it is you're doing, is creating a lot of stress for you and a lot of frustration and a lot of anger and a lot of whatever. So let's just be open about it and say part of what we're trying to do is to tap that and to use it directionally, because if you can share where your biggest pain points are, most of the time it indicates something that is broken underneath, and so you basically say, where does it hurt the most? It's like going to a doctor. It's akin to basically going, I always use this analogy and I say, all right, so Joe, if you come in with elbow pain and I basically come in and say, don't talk to me, let me tell you what your problem is. Or or I basically say, you got swelling on your hand. You got a hand problem. You're going, but doc, my elbow's killing me. we're going to fix your hand. That's kind of like that's the typical mindset. And we're basically, so our approach is basically just saying, where's the pain? Well, let's start with the pain, right? Because, it may or may not be the problem. Underneath it, there's something going on, but the pain is a good marker for saying, yeah, we probably should look at the elbow if that's where it hurts. Yeah. And it may turn out that, well, it's your shoulder. It can be somewhere else, right? So you don't want to be trapped to just looking at the elbow, but you basically say, I got to pay attention to the elbow while I look at your arm.
Right.
Right. So it's really about, to your point again, it's basically saying, acknowledge and embrace, support, and leverage the emotional elements that go around system breakdowns or process breakdowns. And as importantly is engage the people who are doing the work, because they know what's going on. And so it's really about, again, saying that doesn't mean don't include administration. It basically means leverage everybody's expertise where they can add value in that process.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Dr. Van Pelt. The name of the book is It's Not What You're Thinking, Precision Problem Solving with No Hypothesis. His name is Dr. Rick Van Pelt. Rick, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Dr. Van Pelt and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.